Hello and welcome to another edition of Middleware Friday for July 21st, 2017. This is episode 27 of Middleware Friday. Today we're going to talk about Microsoft Flow button integration with ServiceNow. So in addition to this ServiceNow and Microsoft Flow content, we're also going to talk about the choices that you have when considering building applications with Flow, Logic Apps, functions, and web jobs. There is a post by Microsoft which I think is pretty helpful in this context as more and more questions get asked about these different technologies and when is the right time to use each of the respective technologies. So the content itself is based upon, two concepts that I've been recently introduced into. One is a button, physical button called button. bt.tn is the website. And certainly it's not possible without Microsoft supporting those hooks into these physical buttons. And as you can see, there's a blog post here by Addie, and I recently had the opportunity to meet her at the Microsoft Data Insights Summit, and we had been talking about this use case internally, which we'll get to in a few slides, and really the support that Microsoft Flow has allowed this scenario to become a reality. And I think certainly these physical buttons are nothing new. If you followed, some of Amazon's technology, they've had these buttons for a little while. There's other buttons called Flick, which provide similar capabilities. The difference being that they need to be tethered to a Bluetooth device, whereas these buttons don't actually require that a mobile device to be tethered with it. Now, the buttons themselves support a lot of different integration out of the box, including Microsoft Flow and some of its competitors like IFT, Zapier. It does have, support native HTTP, SMS, email, Facebook, and Twitter, just to name some of the different integrations that are available with it. You can select built-in mobile data, so there's room for an actual SIM card, or you can select Wi-Fi for connectivity. In addition to that, it does require batteries or having it plugged in via micro USB. So I'm trying to get my hands on one of these for an actual use case that we have at where I work. But in the meantime, what I've been able to do is use the virtual button, which we're going to show today, and actually build out my Flow interface in order to really build out the solution before I actually get my hands on a physical device. The scenario I have is, much like many organizations, I'm sure, there's a different auditorium or different meeting rooms that have AV. Now, unfortunately, there's usually something that's wrong in these rooms, and it becomes very frustrating to the people that are presenting in them when they show up to the meeting room, and they're usually booked back to back, and all of a sudden there's a piece of audio video equipment that doesn't work. So in some cases, they might have their own mobile device, or they might have their own laptop where they can actually go in and log a ticket, but it's a huge time suck. And at this point, you're typically very stressed out because you've got people that are now walking into the room and you know that your meeting's going to be delayed because you have some sort of audio video issue. Now, what if you had a button, sort of like the Staples Easy button, that you could just press and actually have someone from IT show up and fix this? And basically, it's almost like calling out the bat signal, where you can have a high priority ticket being logged in order to have someone come to your rescue and actually turn that frown upside down and actually fix the issue before it actually causes too many delays. And really, we have the opportunity to do this in part due to the button itself, where it doesn't require a login. Certainly, if it can connect to Wi-Fi, that's a huge plus. Because the idea is that chances are that the computer that could be running some of the AV could be part of the problem, so you don't want to have any dependencies there. From there, you do want the ability to hook into some sort of cloud-based workflow. And certainly the Microsoft Flow team has made this very simple by supporting buttons as triggers. Next, on top of it, we need further connectivity into our service management tool. Now, in this case, we use ServiceNow, so we want the ability to plug into that system. In order to facilitate this communication, I've got a custom API app, which I've used in some of my previous demos when I've needed some SaaS connectivity. certainly I'm going to go ahead and use that adapter or connector once again. The good news is, if you were at Integrate, you know this. If not, you'll see it in some of the upcoming videos, is that Microsoft is working on a ServiceNow connector that's going to provide out-of-the-box connectivity for ServiceNow. That'll be available for Logic apps. I can't imagine why it wouldn't be available for Flow, so I fully expect Flow to be able to plug into that connector in order to light up this sort of scenario. For those that aren't familiar with ServiceNow, it is a SaaS-based IT service management tool. It's very popular. It's in a lot of enterprises, certainly within North America for sure, but I think it's gaining some positive traction in Europe as well. So let's dig into this a little bit further. Now, the first thing you need to do is you need to actually go ahead and either buy your physical button, or you need to go ahead and provision a virtual button. And that's what we're going to do today. So if you go to http://bt.tn, you'll see this web page. And then what you can do is go ahead and click on the link that asks you to claim your free trial virtual button. From there, you're going to want to scroll all the way down to the bottom to click Get Virtual Button. And then you're going to go through what looks like a shopping cart experience. Now, this costs zero money, so don't worry about that. But do note there's a 30-day limitation on its use. So you go ahead and you add this to cart, provide some additional details such as your email address, your address. And then what will happen is you'll get to wait. It does say 1 to 2 business days when you actually fill out the form. For me, it ended up being about 6 hours. So I did this at night, and then I happened to go to sleep. And when I woke up in the morning, sure enough, I had the email in my inbox that allowed me to complete the enrollment process. And really, there's a key and registration code that you need to provide inside of this form, and you'll get that from your email address, and then you can just add some additional information such as your name and email address. From there, what you're going to have is an actual virtual button that's been configured. And by default, it's going to be configured to send you email. But certainly that's not all that this button can actually go ahead and do. You can modify the action, and this is how we will plug into Flow, which I'll show you soon. You can update the information. So for example, this BTTN 16762 isn't overly descriptive. So you can go ahead and update that name and some other information, by clicking on the wheel. And lastly, you can go ahead and launch the virtual button, and I'll show you that shortly when we go to actually test our button scenario. Once I go ahead and change my action or update my action, these are all of the different third-party services that do exist. As you can see, there's the current email, which is available. And in this case, we're talking about Microsoft Flow, so I can go ahead and click on Microsoft Flow. And once I do that, I have some options. I can basically set an action when the button is pressed or when it is not pressed. Certainly in my scenario, I want this trigger to execute upon the button being pressed. We do have the ability to limit how often the button can be pressed. So you can think of this as someone who's really impatient, and they're sitting there and they keep hammering on the button because they're not sure if it's working or not. So you could basically suppress some of the additional presses that do occur when you have some impatient users. So you can select, I believe it's as low as 5 minutes, restricting that you can only press it once per 5 minutes. And you can, certainly there's many options here that you can go through. Next, there's a bit of a summary. If you want to start as a template or reset the counter, you can go ahead and do that. And then finally, just click on Save in order to save your action. Next, if you go into the Flow templates, so you can reach that at flow.microsoft.com and then hit the search window and type in BTTN, you're going to see some of the out-of-the-box button templates that exist. The Zendesk, that's a similar, a competing sort of service desk tool to ServiceNow. So if you're using Zendesk, that'll work. If you want to do this using a SharePoint list or Google Task, you can use those tools as well. I opted to select the button to call technical support for meeting room template, and then really I just adopted it for my use in order to plug in the ServiceNow calls. Once you've gone ahead and chosen that template, you do need to configure your button to basically use your account and use the virtual button that you've just provisioned on the button website. Once you go ahead and log into that service, you're going to be asked to authorize that this button is able to talk to Microsoft Flow. So I want to go ahead and check that off and then click the authorize button. And then we can see that we now have a connection established between my button and Microsoft Flow. Because I was logged into Microsoft Flow, it already detected my Office 365 account, so I didn't have to do anything from that perspective. So let's get into a demo and we'll show you exactly how this works. Here I'm on the button website and I do have the ability to launch the virtual button. And I've named my button main conference room, as that's where we're going to place our first physical button when we get this all set up. And what I can go ahead and do is click this button, and then when I do click the button, it's actually going to execute that workflow, and we're going to see this light illuminate to basically show that it's working. Once I go ahead and acknowledge receipt that a ticket has been logged, then we're going to actually see that switch from being orangish blinking to green, indicating that the service desk has created a ticket and the support technician has actually acknowledged that ticket. So I'm going to go ahead and press this button. And then what I'm going to do is check my email. And here we go. So here's the email that I just received, indicating that a ServiceNow ticket that ends in 27 has been logged for the main conference room. And now as a support person, I need to go ahead and acknowledge that. And once I acknowledge it, we see that the light turns green, indicating that the ticket has been logged successfully. So let's just jump over to ServiceNow. And inside of ServiceNow, we're going to look for the ticket that ends in 027. And sure enough, it says Kentware has logged a ticket for the main conference room. Please proceed to that location immediately. So that's great. That works. Now let's go ahead and take a look at the flow to see how that was built. So here's my flow for the conference room button integration with ServiceNow. I'm going to go ahead and click on that, and we can edit the flow. And what we're going to see is that we've got a button being pressed, and what it's been able to do is inspect, because we did have to log in, that the button ID is the main conference room, which has this particular number. Now here are the ServiceNow calls, and as I mentioned before, these are the custom API or custom connector that I've built. Now when it comes to ServiceNow, whenever you go ahead and create an incident, there's some prerequisite cross-reference data that you have to provide. So for example, when I go ahead and log a ticket, I need to log the ticket under a specific username. So in this case, I'm going to provide my username of kweir, and then what I can go ahead and do is use the system ID for that user when I go ahead and actually create the incident itself. Similarly, if I want to assign this ticket to a group, I need to provide a sysid for that specific group called hardware in order for that to land within the hardware queue. I also have the ability to provide some other information around the impact, the urgency, and the priority. And I can also pass different data elements from the button itself. So for example, there is an email address behind the button when you go ahead and configure it. So I have access to that property. In addition, for the name of the room, or the name of the button in this case, I'm able to provide that property in the ticket description itself. Now, the next piece is I had to acknowledge that receipt of that email, right? So this is using the Outlook connector, and there's a user option called acknowledge, which forces this workflow to essentially wait for someone to acknowledge that email. And certainly if you're clicking a stressed out presenter, you want to ensure that someone is watching these tickets come in and actually responding in a very timely manner. So that's what this allows you to do. In real life, you'd probably put this to a distribution list, because you'd probably have more than one support person watching for these type of emails that come in. Now, as soon as that acknowledgement is received, so here's basically a condition that's going to say, is the selected option equal to acknowledge? and in this case it was, we actually have the ability to provide an acknowledgement back to the button itself, which I think is really cool. So as you recall, it was blinking that yellow orangish color, and then finally it turned green. And it turned green after that acknowledgement was actually received. So what we have the ability to do is there's a callback ID that is provided, and then what we can do is provide whether that's a positive or negative acknowledgement. So we could tweak this some more and basically determine what's the right time to give up waiting for this acknowledgement, and could actually indicate that that was a failed acknowledgement, giving that user feedback who's frantically waiting for that feedback on the button but isn't actually connected to any sort of email or computer at that particular time. Much like any other flow, we can go ahead and see the run history. So for example, here's the one that we just had called, and we can see the different durations that each of the different actions required in order for this entire flow to be completed. So all in all, this was a pretty easy scenario to put together, in part due to the work that the button team has done with the flow team in order to enable these scenarios. That was a really seamless experience. And then just the ability to orchestrate different APIs by using HTTP plus Swagger action really made it simple to actually wire up these different scenarios. Even when there wasn't an out-of-the-box template for ServiceNow, we could leverage an existing one, tweak it a little bit, make a few additional calls, and actually light up the scenario. So without a whole lot of additional work, this would be ready for production and actually could roll this out within the organization. So we did show this, but just in case you want to see it again, once I clicked the button, the ticket was actually logged within ServiceNow, and then basically the acknowledgement email goes out, where you click that acknowledgement, it then basically is received back in the flow. The flow will then pass off to the button connector in order to send that acknowledgement back to the device, indicating that someone is on their way. And in addition, we've got the ServiceNow interface where we actually can see the tickets have been logged, the priority, who the caller was, and the assignment group that's responsible to fix that issue. In addition to the diagnostics that exist from a flow perspective, when you log into the button site, you actually have the ability to see the logs from that perspective. So if there's any ever doubt whether or not a button's been triggered, how often it's been triggered, you do have the ability to look at that diagnostic information as well. Now, in this scenario, we talked about the button service, and there's a little bit of friction involved in getting that set up. It's nothing too bad, but it does take a little bit of time. If you're a little bit more anxious and you just want to play with this some more, there is another option. And the option is really using the flow button. And this was initially how I had wired up my scenario. While I was waiting to get my authorization code from the button service, I just went ahead and used the flow button. And Microsoft provides these flow buttons that are really enabled through your mobile device, and they act in the same manner where you have the ability to trigger a flow by pressing on a button. It's as simple as that. And there's a lot of different templates that you can use in order to get started. So just once again, go into flow.microsoft.com, go into the search bar, type in button, you're going to see these templates show up. And really what it looks like is when you launch the mobile application for Flow and you click on buttons, you've got a couple different, this is where your button will actually show up. So I've got a couple here. There's a very simple template that says send myself a reminder in 10 minutes. And when you click on that, what you'll see is a little push notification 10 minutes later saying, hey, you wanted a reminder, here you go. I also created my own ServiceNow button, so create the ServiceNow ticket from Flow button, and basically that shows up on my mobile device. When I go ahead and click on this orange button, this flow will get triggered, which looks very similar to the one we just walked through. I don't have the acknowledgement functionality in place. All I'm doing is logging the ticket inside of ServiceNow, and then I just go ahead and send an email indicating that a ticket has been logged for that particular event. So feel free to go ahead and try this out. It's very quick to get started, and you can actually get a feel for how buttons work within Flow without having to wait for any sort of registration process. Now, this isn't really so much community content, but I feel it's extremely relevant when we start talking about flow and logic apps, functions, and web jobs. Now, we didn't talk too much about this before, but flow really is that integration software as a service, not to be confused with integration platform as a service. And really the service is designed for office workers and business users, or what's often referred to as citizen integrators, as opposed to logic apps where they target the persona of an IT pro or a developer. And I think what this is really coming from is a lot of sort of the digital transformation initiatives where business users want to be more empowered and they want the ability to automate workflow or connectivity on their own without having to wait for an IT group. And here's some guidance around, when you would want to use each of the different technologies. So certainly if you have a self-service versus a mission critical scenario, certainly from a design perspective, Flow is available in browser and through a mobile app, but it's the UI only. So there's no code behind like you do see with logic apps. You also don't have Visual Studio support for Flow, whereas within logic apps you do, which does allow you to use Visual Studio team services in order to do continuous integration or continuous deployment. So those are sort of those advanced developer features that exist in logic apps, but not within Flow. Within Flow, you are typically developing in production, although you do have the ability to use different environments where you could have, say, a UAT or a test environment, and then you could have a prod environment. If you wanted to go ahead and sort of test things out before you actually light it up. So for example, if you're starting to create data in systems of records like a Salesforce or a dynamic CRM, you probably want to do some level of testing before you go ahead and roll that out, but it may not be at the same level of rigor that your enterprise application integration interfaces would require. When you go ahead and administrate it, there's flow.microsoft.com versus the Azure portal. And then security, there still are security features baked into Flow. It's just not quite as, like I said, advanced or thorough is probably the better term when you think about all of the additional capabilities that Azure brings you. So for example, you've got Azure Security Center and you've got audit logs. Those are going to be exposed at a very granular level for logic apps where you're not going to see it at quite that level from a Flow perspective. But it is important to know that you do have data sovereignty. You've got encryption at rest, and you also have data protection management or DPM with Flow that does allow you to restrict what connectors people within your enterprise can actually go ahead and use. So if you don't want people, having the ability to send a Dropbox, then you can restrict that and basically say that, that's out of bounds. And you have the ability to create different groups. So there might be a subset that does require that functionality, but you don't want to broadly expose it. You do have the ability or the levers to control a lot of that as well. So hopefully that clears it up in terms of, when to use Flow versus logic apps. I think it's a pretty popular question that does come up. Certainly a lot of the integration events that I've attended in the last little while. So with that, that's the end of the show. Thanks for watching. I hope you found that interesting. I know I had a lot of fun building it, so I would encourage people to go ahead and try it out. Look for different scenarios where you could actually go ahead and automate these types of solutions, really rather quickly and inexpensively. So it's a pretty cool scenario to unlock within the enterprise, and just think of all of the different scenarios where you could actually go ahead and use buttons, whether it be for personal use or corporate use. Maybe I'll try to figure out how I can order a burrito by clicking on this button. So that might be my next test for this technology. Once again, I want to thank BizTalk360 for being a great partner of the show. As I've mentioned in earlier episodes, we are in summer hours. So I'm doing a show every second week just to take advantage of some of the good weather and vacation that is upon us here in Canada. So thanks again for watching, and we'll see you next time.